A woman at the grocery store grabbed me and screamed, "Your son just got hit by a car and you're shopping?" I was comparing prices on pasta sauce when her hand clamped around my wrist. Her nails dug into my skin hard enough to leave marks, and her face was inches from mine, twisted with rage and something else I couldn't identify. Panic, maybe? Her breath smelled like coffee and desperation. I tried to pull away, but she had this death grip that made my fingers go numb. People around us stopped shopping and turned to stare at the commotion we were creating in aisle 7. "Your son just got hit by a car across the street and you're in here shopping?" Her voice cracked on the word son, and I saw tears in her eyes. She yanked me toward the front of the store before I could process what she was saying. I stumbled over my own feet, trying to keep up with her frantic pace. My shopping basket clattered to the floor, spilling canned goods everywhere, but she didn't slow down. The automatic doors barely had time to open before she was dragging me through them into the parking lot. "I don't have a son." The words came out confused and breathless because she was moving so fast. She ignored me completely, like I hadn't spoken at all. We crossed the parking lot, and she pulled me toward the street where I could see flashing lights and a crowd gathering. An ambulance sat with its back doors open, and paramedics were loading someone onto a stretcher. My heart started pounding, even though I knew this had nothing to do with me. I didn't have kids. I'd never had kids. This woman had the wrong person. "Stop lying." Her voice was venomous now. "I saw you drop him off at school this morning. I watched you kiss his forehead and tell him to have a good day." She was crying openly as she dragged me closer to the accident scene. A police officer looked up and saw us approaching. The woman pointed at me and shouted that I was the mother who'd abandoned her child. The officer's expression shifted from concern to something harder as he stepped toward us, blocking our path to the ambulance. "Ma'am, is this your son?" The officer addressed me directly, and I could see the judgment already forming in his eyes. Behind him on the stretcher, I caught a glimpse of a small figure covered in blood with dark hair matted to his forehead. My stomach turned over, but not with recognition. With horror at what this woman was accusing me of. I shook my head, trying to find words that would make sense of this nightmare I'd been pulled into without warning or explanation. "I've never seen that child before in my life." My voice was shaking. The woman who'd grabbed me made a sound like a wounded animal and tried to lunge at me, but the officer caught her arm. She was screaming now that I was a liar and a terrible mother, that I'd dropped my son off and then gone shopping like nothing mattered, that she'd watched the whole thing happen. The boy had run into the street chasing a ball, and the car couldn't stop in time. She'd been standing right there and seen everything. The officer asked for my identification, and I pulled out my wallet with trembling hands. He examined my driver's license while the woman kept screaming accusations. More people had gathered now, forming a circle around us. I could feel their eyes judging me before they even knew the facts. A mother who shops while her child bleeds out on the pavement. That's what they saw. That's what this woman had convinced them to see. The officer spoke into his radio requesting backup, and suddenly I realized this was escalating beyond a simple misunderstanding. "My name is Astrid Keller. I'm 26 years old, and I don't have children." I tried to keep my voice steady. The officer looked at me skeptically and asked if I was certain about that. The question was so absurd I almost laughed, except nothing about this situation was funny. The woman was being pulled away by another officer, but she kept screaming that she'd seen me, that she knew what I'd done, that I couldn't just pretend my son didn't exist because it was convenient. A paramedic approached and asked if I could identify the child for medical records. They needed to contact family and get consent for treatment. I followed him to the ambulance, even though every instinct told me to run from this scene. The boy on the stretcher was maybe 7 or 8 years old, with blood covering his face and arms. His eyes were closed, and an oxygen mask covered his nose and mouth. I stared at him, trying to feel something. Recognition. Maternal instinct. Anything that would explain why this woman thought he was mine. "I've never seen this child before." I said it clearly so the paramedic could document it. He looked uncomfortable, like he didn't know whether to believe me or not. Behind me, the woman was still screaming through her tears. She kept saying she'd seen me at the school, that she recognized my face and my car, that she'd been watching me for weeks now because something seemed off about how I treated my son. Her words painted a picture of neglect and abuse that made my skin crawl. The first officer came back with my license and asked where I'd been this morning. I told him I'd gone to work at the accounting firm downtown, same as every weekday. I'd left my apartment at 7:30 and gone straight to the office. I could provide my time card and security footage if needed. He wrote everything down in a small notebook, asking for the address of my workplace and the names of coworkers who could verify my presence. I gave him my supervisor's direct number. The woman had calmed down enough to give her own statement to the second officer. Her name was Margaret Riley, and she lived 2 blocks from Jefferson Elementary School. She'd been walking her dog when she saw me drop the boy off this morning around 8:15. She'd noticed us before on other days and thought something seemed wrong with our dynamic. The boy always looked sad, and I never stayed to watch him go inside the building. This morning, after I'd driven away, the boy had been playing in the schoolyard when his ball rolled into the street. Margaret described my car as a dark blue sedan. My actual car was a silver hatchback currently parked in the grocery store lot. She described my outfit as jeans and a red jacket. I was wearing black slacks and a gray sweater. She described me as having long blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. My hair was short and brown, barely reaching my shoulders. Every single detail she gave was wrong, but she said them with such conviction that I could see the officers struggling with who to believe. A third officer arrived and confirmed my car in the parking lot matched my description, not Margaret's. He'd also run my plates and found no connection to the school or any children. The first officer made a call to my workplace and spoke with my supervisor, who confirmed I'd been at my desk all morning. I watched the doubt start creeping into their faces as they realized Margaret's story had holes. But she was still insisting she'd seen me, that she knew what she'd witnessed. The paramedics needed to transport the boy to the hospital immediately. His injuries were severe and time was critical. They asked one more time if anyone could identify him or provide contact information for his family. Margaret said she'd seen the boy at that school every morning but didn't know his name. She'd assumed I was his mother based on nothing but her own observations and assumptions. The ambulance pulled away with sirens blaring, and suddenly the scene felt emptier. Less urgent, but more uncomfortable. An officer named Sergeant Finch took over and asked me to come to the station to give a formal statement. He said it was just procedure, but I could tell there was still suspicion in his eyes. Margaret was asked to come as well to explain the discrepancies in her identification. We rode in separate patrol cars to the police station downtown. I sat in the back seat watching the city pass by and trying to understand how I'd gone from buying groceries to being accused of child abandonment in less than 20 minutes. The police station smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. Sergeant Finch led me to a small interview room with concrete walls and a metal table. He asked me to sit and wait while they processed some paperwork. I sat there alone for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I kept replaying the moment Margaret grabbed me. The absolute certainty in her voice when she said I was that boy's mother. The conviction in her eyes when she accused me of neglect. Finch came back with a female detective named Yolanda Cross. She had kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor that made me sit up straighter. She explained they'd contacted Jefferson Elementary and found that a student named Owen Marsh had been reported absent that morning. Owen was 7 years old with dark hair and brown eyes matching the injured boy. His mother had called the school around 9 saying Owen was sick and wouldn't be attending. The school had a photo of Owen in their records, and Detective Cross showed it to me on her phone. The boy in the photo was definitely the child from the accident. I'd never seen him before in any context. Detective Cross asked if I knew anyone named Marsh or had any connection to that family. I said no to everything. She asked about my daily routine and whether I ever drove past Jefferson Elementary. I explained my route to work took me nowhere near that school. She asked if I had any enemies or anyone who might want to frame me for something. The question seemed absurd, but I took it seriously. I couldn't think of anyone who hated me enough to stage something this elaborate. Detective Cross left to check on Margaret's statement. I sat alone again, counting the tiles on the ceiling. 42 tiles with water stains on at least 6 of them. I was cataloging these meaningless details because the alternative was thinking about that boy bleeding on the pavement, thinking about how someone's actual mother was probably getting the worst phone call of her life right now, thinking about how Margaret Riley had been so wrong but so certain. The detective came back an hour later with news that changed everything. Margaret had admitted under questioning that she'd been wrong about the timeline. She hadn't actually seen me drop Owen off this morning. She'd seen someone who looked like me drop off a child who looked like Owen yesterday morning. She'd been so focused on the car accident and so panicked about the injured child that she'd convinced herself the woman from yesterday was me. Her memory had filled in details that weren't there, created certainty where there should have been doubt. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by anger. Margaret had assaulted me in public, dragged me to an accident scene, caused a massive scene that dozens of people witnessed, all based on faulty memory and assumptions. Detective Cross seemed to read my expression because she said they'd be having a serious conversation with Margaret about false accusations and wasting police resources. But she also said Margaret had genuinely believed she was helping a child. Her intentions had been good even if her execution was catastrophically wrong. They'd located Owen's actual mother. Her name was Catherine Marsh, and she was on her way to the hospital. She'd been at home thinking her son was safe in bed recovering from a stomach bug. Instead, he'd apparently snuck out and gone to school anyway. He'd been playing during recess when the accident happened. Catherine was beside herself with guilt and terror. Detective Cross said I was free to go, but they might need additional statements later. She apologized for the ordeal and said someone would drive me back to the grocery store. I sat in the back of another patrol car feeling numb. The officer driving made awkward small talk about the weather that I barely registered. When we pulled into the grocery store parking lot, I saw my car exactly where I'd left it. My shopping basket was still on the ground in aisle 7 where I'd dropped it. The store manager found me standing there staring at the spilled cans and offered to help me finish my shopping. His kindness made me want to cry, but I held it together. I picked up my basket and mechanically completed my grocery list. At the checkout, the cashier recognized me from earlier. She asked if everything was okay with my son, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment. She'd clearly heard Margaret's accusations and assumed they were true. I explained quietly that there'd been a misunderstanding, that the boy wasn't mine and the woman who grabbed me had been mistaken. The cashier looked skeptical but rang up my groceries without further comment. I could feel other customers staring at me trying to decide if I was a victim or a villain. I drove home in a daze and sat in my apartment with my groceries still in bags on the counter. My hands had stopped shaking, but I felt disconnected from my body, like I was watching myself from outside and couldn't quite make the pieces fit together. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Detective Cross asking if I could come back to the station. They'd uncovered something about Margaret Riley that I needed to know. The detective's office was less intimidating than the interview room. She had photos of her family on the desk and a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Detective." She gestured for me to sit and pulled out a file folder. Margaret Riley had a history. 5 years ago, she'd lost her daughter in a car accident. The girl had been 9 years old and her name was Emily. She'd run into the street chasing after her dog and been hit by a delivery truck. Margaret had been inside her house and heard the impact. She'd run outside to find her daughter dying on the pavement. The trauma had broken something in Margaret. She'd developed an obsession with child safety and school zones. She spent hours sitting near elementary schools watching parents drop off their kids. She took photos of cars that drove too fast. She reported parents to CPS based on nothing but her own observations of what she considered neglectful behavior. The police had talked to her multiple times about harassment, but she always insisted she was protecting children, preventing another Emily. Detective Cross said when Margaret saw Owen get hit this morning, something in her mind had snapped. She'd needed someone to blame, someone to hold accountable in a way she couldn't when her own daughter died. The woman she'd seen yesterday dropping off a child became me in her fractured memory. She'd created a narrative where I was the negligent mother who deserved punishment, where she could be the hero who exposed the truth, where maybe somehow she could save this child in a way she hadn't been able to save Emily. I listened to all of this trying to feel sympathy for Margaret, but mostly feeling angry. Her trauma didn't excuse what she'd done to me. Her grief didn't make it okay to assault me in public and accuse me of abandoning a child. Detective Cross agreed and said Margaret would be charged with assault and filing a false police report. She'd also be required to undergo psychiatric evaluation. But Cross wanted me to understand the context, to know that Margaret wasn't evil, just broken. I asked about Owen Marsh. Detective Cross said he was in surgery but expected to survive. He had a broken leg and some internal injuries, but nothing that wouldn't heal. His mother, Catherine, was devastated with guilt. She'd had no idea Owen had left the house. He'd told her he was going back to bed, and she'd believed him. She'd been doing laundry when he snuck out the back door. She blamed herself completely for not watching him more carefully, for not checking on him sooner. I wanted to tell Catherine it wasn't her fault, that kids do unexpected things, that you can't watch them every second of every day. But I didn't even know her. I was just the woman who got blamed for her son's accident based on nothing but a grieving stranger's faulty memory. Detective Cross gave me her card and said to call if I experienced any harassment or threats related to this incident. She warned me that some people who witnessed the scene might still believe Margaret's version, that social media could be unkind. She was right about social media. By the time I got home that evening, someone had posted video of Margaret dragging me through the parking lot. The caption said, "Mother abandons son who gets hit by car, then tries to finish shopping." The video had been shared hundreds of times. Comments called me a monster. People found my social media accounts and started sending death threats. Someone found out where I worked and called my office demanding I be fired. My supervisor called me at home asking what the hell was going on. I spent 3 hours that night reporting accounts and trying to explain the situation to strangers who'd already decided I was guilty. Most platforms wouldn't remove the video because it was considered news. My name was trending locally with hashtags about accountability and justice for Owen. People were calling for my arrest, demanding I be put on a child abuse registry. Someone started a petition to have me investigated by CPS, even though I had no children to investigate. The mob had found their villain and facts didn't matter anymore. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Margaret's face twisted with rage, heard her voice accusing me of abandoning my son, felt her nails digging into my wrist. I got up at 3 a.m. and searched for news about Owen. I found an update from the hospital saying he was stable after surgery. Catherine had released a statement thanking everyone for their concern and asking for privacy. She didn't mention me at all, which felt like a small mercy. The next morning, I called in sick to work. My supervisor said it was probably for the best given the circumstances. He didn't say I was suspended, but I could hear it in his voice. The firm didn't want the negative publicity. I was becoming a liability. I spent the day in my apartment with the curtains closed, watching my phone blow up with notifications. Someone had found my address and posted it online. People were suggesting others visit me to have a conversation about my actions. Detective Cross called around noon to warn me that things were escalating online. She said patrol cars would increase in my neighborhood, and I should call 911 immediately if anyone approached my door. She'd contacted the platform where the original video was posted, requesting it be removed based on the false narrative, but they'd refused, citing public interest. The truth was getting drowned out by rage and righteousness. I asked if I could do a public statement to explain what actually happened. She advised against it, saying anything I said would be twisted to fit the existing narrative. Around 2 p.m, someone knocked on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw a woman I didn't recognize holding a large envelope. She said she was a process server and needed me to sign for delivery. My hands shook as I opened the door just wide enough to take the envelope. Inside was a lawsuit. Catherine Marsh was suing me for emotional distress and negligent supervision of Owen. The filing claimed I was responsible for Owen's injuries due to my failure to properly supervise him before he entered the street. I called Detective Cross immediately. She said this was insane and the lawsuit would be thrown out, but I'd need a lawyer to defend myself. She gave me the name of someone who did pro bono civil rights work. I called and left a message explaining the situation. The lawyer called back within an hour. Her name was Simone Dwyer, and she specialized in cases of wrongful accusation. She'd already seen the video and read about the situation. She said the lawsuit was baseless, but defending it would be expensive and time-consuming. Simone explained that Catherine was probably being pressured by others who believed the false narrative. Someone had convinced her that I was responsible and she should seek justice. The lawsuit would fail because there was no evidence I'd ever had any contact with Owen. But the process of proving that would cost thousands in legal fees and take months. She offered to take my case and said she'd file a motion to dismiss immediately. She'd also start preparing a defamation suit against several parties who'd spread false information about me. That night, someone threw a brick through my living room window. It shattered glass across my couch and floor, leaving a note wrapped around it. The note said, "Child abusers deserve worse than this." I called the police and they sent officers to take a report. They couldn't do much without witnesses or security footage. They suggested I file for a restraining order against Margaret and anyone else making specific threats. I swept up the glass and covered the window with cardboard. I couldn't afford to fix it until my next paycheck. The lawsuit made local news. Reporters stood outside my apartment building trying to get comments. I stopped leaving my apartment except for absolute necessities. I had groceries delivered and worked remotely when my supervisor finally cleared me to return. My coworkers were distant and cold in video meetings. No one wanted to be associated with the woman accused of child abandonment. It didn't matter that the accusations were false. The stain had already spread. Simone filed the motion to dismiss and included affidavits from Detective Cross and Sergeant Finch explaining the false identification. She included my work records proving I'd been nowhere near the school. She included Margaret's admission that she'd been wrong about the timeline and identity. The judge granted the motion and dismissed the lawsuit within 2 weeks. Catherine's lawyer withdrew immediately, saying he'd been misled about the facts. But the damage was already done. Someone created a website dedicated to exposing me. It had photos of my apartment building and workplace. It had screenshots of my social media before I'd locked everything down. It had the video of Margaret dragging me through the parking lot played on a loop. It had a map showing my daily routes with suggestions for where people might run into me. Simone got an emergency injunction to take the site down, but it kept getting rebuilt on different servers. Margaret was arraigned on assault charges. She showed up to court in a black dress, looking frail and broken. Her lawyer argued she'd been in the grip of a psychiatric episode related to her untreated PTSD. The prosecutor asked for jail time. The judge sentenced her to probation and mandatory counseling. She had to pay restitution for my medical bills from the wrist injury and my broken window. She was ordered to have no contact with me. She walked out of court and reporters swarmed her asking if she regretted her actions. She said no. She said she'd been trying to help a child and would do it again. That statement went viral. People praised Margaret for standing up for children. They called her a hero who'd made an honest mistake. They said even if she was wrong about my identity, her heart was in the right place. They said I should be grateful someone cared enough to act. They said my lawsuit was vindictive, that I was the real villain for trying to punish a grieving mother. The narrative had become so twisted that facts didn't penetrate anymore. Owen recovered fully from his injuries. Catherine released another statement saying she regretted filing the lawsuit, that she'd been overwhelmed and manipulated by others, that she wanted to move on and focus on her son. She didn't apologize to me directly. I understood why. Any public apology would be seen as weakness. The mob would turn on her for defending me. She was protecting herself and her son. I couldn't blame her for that, even though it meant I'd never get the public vindication I needed. Simone's defamation lawsuit went after 3 specific individuals who'd spread false information with the most reach. One was a local social media influencer who'd made a video calling me a child abuser with no evidence. Another was a blogger who'd written an article about my supposed pattern of neglect based on nothing but the initial video. The third was a podcaster who'd done a full episode analyzing my body language and concluding I was guilty. All 3 had huge platforms and had refused to issue corrections even after the facts came out. The influencer settled quickly and issued a public apology with a retraction. The blogger fought it longer, but eventually agreed to remove the article and pay damages. The podcaster refused to back down, claiming everything he'd said was opinion protected by free speech. We ended up in court where Simone systematically destroyed his arguments. The judge found him liable for defamation and awarded me significant damages. He was ordered to issue a correction on his podcast and donate to a charity for wrongly accused individuals. None of it felt like victory. The settlements couldn't undo the damage to my reputation. The retractions didn't reach the same audience as the original accusations. Most people who'd seen the video never saw the corrections. They still believed I was the woman who'd abandoned her son. I still got recognized in public sometimes. Still saw people whisper and point. Still felt the weight of accusatory stares. I moved to a different apartment across town. Started therapy to process the trauma of being publicly vilified. Changed jobs because the atmosphere at my old firm never recovered. I deleted all my social media accounts and started using a different name in daily interactions. I became smaller and quieter, trying to avoid attention. Trying not to be seen because being seen meant being judged. Simone stayed in touch, checking on me regularly. She said she'd represented dozens of people wrongly accused of various things, that the psychological toll was often worse than any legal consequence, that society's rush to judgment left permanent scars. She suggested I join a support group for people who'd been publicly shamed. I went to one meeting and couldn't go back. Hearing other people's stories made me feel worse, not better. 1 year after the incident, Detective Cross called me. She said Margaret Riley had been arrested again. She'd grabbed another woman at a different grocery store, accusing her of abuse. This time, there was video from the beginning showing Margaret had targeted a complete stranger. The woman pressed charges immediately. The prosecutor was asking for jail time, citing Margaret's pattern of behavior and violation of probation. Cross said they'd need me to testify at the hearing. I didn't want to face Margaret again, but I knew I had to. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning. I took the day off work and wore my most professional outfit. Margaret was already seated when I arrived with her lawyer beside her. She looked older than I remembered. Gray hair where there'd been brown, deep lines around her mouth and eyes. She looked at me and I saw no recognition in her face. I was just another person she'd targeted in her broken crusade to save children. The prosecutor called me to testify about the original incident. I described being grabbed in the grocery store, being dragged to the accident scene, being accused in front of dozens of witnesses, the harassment and threats that followed, the lawsuit and the broken window and the lost job. Margaret's lawyer objected several times, saying my suffering wasn't relevant to this hearing. The judge allowed my testimony, saying it established a pattern of harmful behavior. Margaret testified in her own defense. She said she'd been off her medications, that she'd been having flashbacks to Emily's death, that every time she saw a child in danger, she was transported back to that moment of losing her daughter, that she couldn't help but intervene even when her perception of danger was distorted. Her voice broke when she talked about Emily, about hearing the sound of impact, about holding her daughter's body in the street, about the guilt that never faded. I felt something unexpected listening to her. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. She was trapped in a loop of trauma that kept replaying. She was trying to save her daughter over and over through other children. She couldn't separate past from present, couldn't distinguish real danger from imagined threat. She was broken in a way that medication and therapy hadn't been able to fix. She needed help, not punishment, but the judge had to consider public safety. The judge sentenced Margaret to 18 months in a psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment. She'd be transferred to state custody immediately. She'd receive intensive therapy and medication management. She'd be evaluated every 3 months to determine if she was improving. If she made progress, she might be released to outpatient care. If not, she'd remain institutionalized until she was no longer a danger to herself or others. Margaret started crying when the sentence was read. Her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder, but she shook it off. After the hearing, Detective Cross walked me to my car. She said she hoped this would give me some closure. That knowing Margaret was getting help might make what happened to me feel less senseless. I told her honestly I didn't know what I felt. Relieved maybe that Margaret couldn't hurt anyone else right now. Sad that Emily's death had rippled out to cause so much more pain. Angry that I'd been caught in the blast radius of someone else's tragedy. Grateful that it was finally over. The local news covered the sentencing. This time the story focused on Margaret's mental health struggles rather than her accusations against me. The comment sections were more sympathetic. People talked about the need for better mental health services, about how trauma can destroy people years after the initial event, about how grief can make you do things you'd never normally do. Almost no one mentioned me or acknowledged I'd been wrongly accused. I was a footnote in Margaret's larger story of suffering. I went back to therapy and talked about feeling erased, about how my trauma was invisible compared to Margaret's dramatic loss, about how people had more sympathy for her grief than for my destroyed reputation. My therapist said both things could be true. Margaret's pain was real and valid. So was mine. They didn't cancel each other out. I could acknowledge her suffering while still being angry about how it had harmed me. I could want her to get help while also needing justice for what she'd done. Simone called with news that one of the social media platforms had finally taken down the original video after 18 months of appeals. It had been viewed over 2 million times, but at least it wouldn't reach anyone new. The other platform still hosted it, citing newsworthiness. Simone was pursuing legal action but warned me it could take years. I told her to keep fighting. Not because I thought we'd win, but because someone needed to push back against the systems that destroyed people without accountability. I ran into Catherine Marsh at the grocery store, the same grocery store where this all started. I was in the cereal aisle when I saw her pushing a cart with a young boy walking beside her. Owen was taller than I remembered and moving without any visible limp. Catherine saw me and froze. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then she walked over and quietly said she was sorry, that she'd been wrong to file that lawsuit, that she'd let other people convince her I was responsible when she knew in her heart it wasn't true. I asked her how Owen was doing. She said he was thriving, that he'd needed some physical therapy but made a full recovery, that he still had nightmares sometimes about the accident but they were getting less frequent, that she'd been in therapy too, learning to forgive herself for not knowing he'd left the house. She asked how I was doing and I gave her the standard response. Fine. Moving forward. Doing better. The lies we tell to end uncomfortable conversations. Owen tugged on his mother's sleeve asking who I was. Catherine hesitated and I could see her deciding what to say. She told him I was someone she knew from a while ago, someone she needed to apologize to for a misunderstanding. Owen lost interest immediately and went back to examining cereal boxes. Catherine touched my arm briefly and said she hoped I could move past this someday. I nodded because what else could I do? We parted and continued our shopping in different aisles. 2 years after the incident, I was in a different city at a training conference for work. I'd gotten promoted to senior analyst and was rebuilding my career slowly. During a lunch break, I sat in the hotel restaurant scrolling through my phone. A notification popped up from a news aggregator. Margaret Riley had been released from psychiatric care. She was living in a supervised group home and continuing outpatient treatment. Her lawyer had released a statement saying she was doing much better and wanted to thank everyone who'd supported her recovery. I sat there staring at the notification, feeling complicated things. Relief that she was getting better. Anxiety about whether she'd stay stable. Anger that her recovery was news while my continued struggle was invisible. Sadness that Emily's death had created this endless ripple effect of pain. I closed the app and finished my lunch. I had a presentation to give in 30 minutes and couldn't afford to be distracted by the past. That night in my hotel room, I wrote something I'd been avoiding for 2 years. I wrote about being grabbed in the grocery store, about the accusation and the mob and the harassment, about losing my job and my reputation and my sense of safety. I wrote about how trauma doesn't end when the immediate crisis is over, how it burrows in and changes you in ways people can't see. I wrote about Margaret and Emily and Owen and Catherine, about how we were all connected by one moment of tragedy and mistaken identity. I posted it anonymously on a platform for sharing difficult experiences. The responses surprised me. Dozens of people reached out sharing their own stories of being wrongly accused, of having their lives destroyed by false narratives, of struggling to rebuild after public judgment. Some had been accused of crimes, others of abuse or misconduct. All of them carried the same invisible scars, the same wariness, the same anger at systems that destroyed first and asked questions later. Reading their stories made me feel less alone in a way the support group never had. I thought about Margaret often over the following months. Wondered if she was really better or just better at hiding her symptoms. Wondered if she thought about me at all. If she remembered my face from the courtroom, or if I was just another blur in her fractured memories. Wondered if she'd found peace with Emily's death, or if she was still fighting that losing battle to save her daughter through strangers' children. 5 years after the grocery store incident, I was living in a new city with a new name. I'd gotten married to someone who knew my story and loved me anyway. I had a good job with people who respected my work. I'd rebuilt my life piece by piece into something stable and quiet. The video still existed online in archived corners, but most people had forgotten about it. The rage had moved on to new targets, new villains to destroy. I was old news. I learned that Margaret Riley had died. She'd had a heart attack in the group home. She was 63. The obituary mentioned her daughter Emily and requested donations to a child safety foundation in Emily's name. It didn't mention me or Owen or any of the people she'd targeted. It painted her as a grieving mother who'd struggled with loss. Which was true, but incomplete. She'd been that, and also someone whose pain had hurt others. Both things were true. I didn't go to her funeral, but I sent flowers. White lilies with a card that said, "May you find peace." I meant it for Emily as much as Margaret, for all of us trapped in the aftermath of that one terrible moment when Emily ran into the street chasing her dog, for Catherine and Owen learning to forgive and heal, for me trying to rebuild from ashes, for every person ever destroyed by someone else's certainty in the face of incomplete facts. We all deserved peace even if we'd never fully find it.